In this video, I'm going to be going over some points about Chapter 17, which is cardiovascular. This begins a 3-chapter unit on the cardiovascular system, beginning with the heart. And in this video, we're mainly going to be covering some of the major anatomical portions of the heart, which we'll also see in the lab portion as well. To begin with, though, we're going to look at some of the major functions. And so your book kind of mentions 5 major functions as an overview and introduction of the heart. Number 1, the heart generates blood pressure. It's basically a 4-chambered pump that creates the blood pressure of the body. Number 2, it routes the blood, and we'll talk about how that you have a pulmonary circuit that's sending blood over to the lungs, and then that blood returns back to the heart once you go through gas exchange. And then systemic circulation, that's sending blood out to the rest of the body systems. Number 3 is to ensure one-way blood flow, and so you have 4 main valves located in the heart, and so we'll be talking about those a little later. And that allows blood to flow in only one direction through the heart. And then number 4 is to regulate blood supply. This you can think of as a homeostasis type process in which your heart can change the contraction rate. And so in other words, your heart rate can increase or decrease, and your blood pressure and the force that the heart is contracting with can actually increase and decrease. And that helps to deliver the blood requirements out to the body based on your metabolic needs. And then, of course, don't forget that the heart does produce a hormone, and we talked about that back in Chapter 16, and that hormone is ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide. So to begin talking about the heart anatomy a little bit, let's look at just a few general points. Number 1, it is roughly the size of a closed fist. The shape of it, you can kind of see in the diagram here, it has a pointed tip area located at the bottom. This is known as the apex region. And then the upper portion is relatively flat. That's known as the base region. And then it is located in the chest cavity, the thoracic cavity, in a region called the mediastinum. You may remember that vocabulary word back from 168. The mediastinum just means the middle of the chest cavity area. Few layers of the heart in this slide. We'll look at the pericardium, and that's basically a membrane system located around the heart. You may have talked about the serous type membranes that are found in the body. That was covered also in 168. But here you have the serous membrane that covers the heart. It is a doubled layer membrane. And if you remember how the serous membranes work, you have a layer towards the outside of the organ that's known as the parietal layer. And you have a layer that actually comes in contact with the surface of the organ. That's called the visceral layer. And then in between that, you have a little bit of a space that's called the pericardial cavity. And that's usually where you find a little bit of serous fluid, a little bit of fluid that kind of helps cushion and protect the organ, in this case, the heart. So this serous membrane is known as the pericardium. The other thing to note here is that the visceral pericardium, this is the innermost layer of that membrane that contacts the heart, is also known as the epicardium. So you have a situation where you have 2 words here for the same structure. So the epicardium and the visceral pericardium are the same. Now that we kind of established that, let's look at the layers of the heart. If you were to do like a cross section and you kind of pull up a section of the heart, you would start with that inner, or the outermost, really the outermost layer, that serous membrane we just talked about. Remember, that's the epicardium, which is the same thing as the visceral pericardium. So you have that layer of serous membrane on the outside. Then you have the muscle layer, the myocardium. Remember that myo is a prefix that refers to muscle. And so the myocardium is the cardiac muscle, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Cardiac muscle that's seen here. And then just below that, there's another thin layer called the endocardium. The endocardium is another membrane that separates that from the actual chambers of the heart. Now, just inside of the ventricles, you see some tissue here, some muscle tissue here called trabeculae carni. It's muscular tissue. You may recognize the word trabeculae from the study of your skeletal anatomy, because you see that same type of scaffolding structure in your spongy bones. And so it's there for support. So you have a muscular ridge, series of muscular ridges inside of the ventricles kind of the edges of the ventricles there that support the walls of the heart. Now, to study the anatomy of the heart, we also need to study the four major chambers, and they're listed there for you, the left and right atrium. Notice the word atrium, that's singular, so if you're talking about the two together, that would be atria. And so, and then you have the left and the right ventricles, and then separating the atria, and I'll show you this on a diagram, but separating each atrium from a ventricle is a sulcus. Remember, this word sulcus, you may have seen in 168, refers to a depression or a groove. And it's called the coronary sulcus because usually you find some coronary blood vessels located in that groove. And so I think I have a picture of that, kind of show you here. So find a good picture of the heart. You can use this one or some that are in your textbook. Kind of orient yourself to the different structures. And of course, you'll see this in lab as well. But here are the four chambers. You can see the right atrium here. Here is that dividing groove called the coronary sulcus that divides the atrium from the ventricle. And this would be the right ventricle. And then the left ventricle is over on this side. And then you can just barely make out a little bit of the left atrium and on the other side there. A few things about the atria. They are the upper chambers, and they're generally referred to as holding chambers, or sometimes they're called receiving chambers because they're the first chambers. When blood is returning back to the heart, they receive the blood first. And so at the end of this video, we'll be looking at blood flowing through the heart and kind of mapping that out. So blood coming back to the heart, whether it's coming back from the lungs or the body itself, is going to go to the atria first. They're relatively small chambers and relatively thin-walled. In other words, their muscle layer is relatively thin. And so they don't need a lot of muscular power, so they contract minimally because whenever they contract, they're just sending blood down to the ventricles. And so they don't have very far to send the blood. Now, there's a division or a septum or a wall that separates the two atria, and that's called the interatrial septum, and that separates both the right atrium from the left atrium. Now, the right atrium, the right side of the body, is receiving blood from three locations. This is receiving deoxygenated blood or oxygen-poor blood from three locations, and they're listed out for you: the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. The superior vena cava is receiving deoxygenated blood from anywhere above the diaphragm, such as the head, neck, thorax or chest cavity, the upper limbs, the arms. Everywhere else below the diaphragm, your abdominal area, your pelvic cavity, your lower limbs, that's returning back to the right atrium up through the inferior vena cava. Then the heart muscle itself drains blood from the myocardium, or the heart muscle itself goes back into the right atrium through the coronary sinus. The left atrium, again, it's an atrium, so it's a receiving chamber, a holding chamber. It's receiving blood from the lungs, and that comes from pulmonary veins coming from the lungs back over to the heart, and that they empty into the left atrium. So again, you see a diagram here. Now this diagram, they've kind of show you a cross section so you can kind of see the inside, what everything looks like. Orient you to a few things. Here's the superior vena cava draining blood from above the diaphragm going into the right atrium. Here's the inferior vena cava coming up, and then there's a small little opening here called the coronary sinus. All three of these locations drain blood into the right atrium. Here's the left atrium, and that's receiving blood from the lungs. And then whenever these contract, the right atrium contracts, it sends blood through a valve, and it goes into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, we'll talk about this in a minute, but when it contracts, it sends blood up through the pulmonary trunk that goes over to the lungs. And then similarly on the left side of the heart, when the left atrium contracts, it sends blood down through this valve. We'll talk about that. And then it goes into the left ventricle. When that contracts, when the left ventricle contracts, it sends blood through another valve, past another valve, up through the aorta, and it sends blood out through the body. Notice that the diagram is color-coded, so the blue areas, whether it's a chamber or a vessel, represent deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood. And so this is sending blood, it's receiving blood from the body and it's sending blood over to the lungs so that it can go through gas exchange and pick up oxygen. Now that oxygenated blood, the oxygen-rich blood, returns back to the heart, and now it's red, and so it's oxygen-rich, and that's sending blood back out to the rest of the body. The ventricles, second type of chamber, they're the lower portion. They're referred to as pumping chambers because they contract. They contract with a lot of force. They're relatively thick. The muscle layer is thick. They're strong-walled, and so they have to send blood out further than the atria do because they have to send blood. On the left side, that's sending blood out to the body. The right side is sending blood over to the lungs. They are separated by a wall or a septum, and that's called the interventricular septum. And so we kind of mentioned this already, but here you see the right ventricle on the right side of the heart. It's pumping blood up to the pulmonary trunk. The left ventricle, when it contracts, is pumping blood up to the aorta. Coronary arteries, your book kind of mentioned some coronary arteries. I'm not going to go through a lot of these. I just want to mention that they are the vessels that are supplying the heart muscle with the blood supply. And so you can see a list of them on the diagram. We're not going to go through all of these, but you can see the coronary arteries are listed here, and they basically come off of the aorta, and they're carrying oxygen-rich blood to the different areas of the heart itself, around to the posterior side of the heart, and that's what's supplying the heart muscle, the myocardium layer, with oxygen. Then you also have coronary veins, and remember, they all will eventually go into the coronary sinus region. We mentioned that already because that's where all of the veins empty the deoxygenated blood from the heart, empty there, and that goes into the right atrium. Now let's look briefly at the 4 valves that are in the heart. Remember that valves help to ensure one-way blood flow in the heart. And so you have 4 main valves, 2 different categories. 2 of them are AV valves, which stands for atrioventricular. That's the location of where these are at, atrioventricular. So if you find an atrium and a ventricle right in between that area, you'll find an AV valve. And so if you're on the right side of the heart, then the valve that's located between the right atrium and the right ventricle would be the tricuspid valve. If you're looking at the left side of the heart, the valve that's between the left atrium and the left ventricle, that's called the bicuspid valve, or sometimes you'll see it called the mitral valve. This is just another view that I found looking down at the heart, looking down at the valves, and you can see that the bicuspid valve has 2 flaps of tissue called cusps, and that's where it gets its name from. The tricuspid valve actually has 3. Then the other 2 valves, remember there's 4 valves, so the other 2 valves are semilunar valves, and they're found at the base of the pulmonary trunk. And so here's the pulmonary trunk, and so there's a valve here, and the base of the aorta, there's a valve here. And so one thing to start thinking about is the flow of blood through the heart, and kind of how these valves open and close and when they need to open and close. And so this slide just kind of gives you an example here of what's happening. You see blood coming into the left atrium, and that's coming in from the lung. So this is oxygen-rich blood going into the left atrium. This is showing you what happens whenever the bicuspid valve is open. So this valve, or this atrium here, would contract. That would send blood down into the left ventricle. It's relaxed at this point, and so blood would start filling up inside of this chamber. And so at this point, this aortic semilunar valve would be closed. But notice what happens whenever the chamber contracts. The ventricle contracts, blood tries to move out, just like you're squeezing on a water balloon. That water's going to want to go somewhere. So here you're trying to squeeze, your ventricle is squeezing, it's creating pressure inside the chamber, but this valve is keeping it closed, keeping this valve closed so the blood does not go backwards. You don't want the blood to go back into the left atrium. Instead, it allows the aortic valve to open, and so blood is going to go out, eject out of the ventricle going into the aorta. Now the cords here, I didn't mention this on the last slide. You have some cords, some connective tissue that connect the valve, this bicuspid valve, to the bottom chamber, to the bottom of the chamber, called chordae tendineae. And the tension here is high whenever this this contracts, because it's basically suspending these valves, keeping them from opening back up or going too far. That's called a prolapse valve. And so you don't want this valve to open up, and that would allow more blood to leak, leak backwards. So whenever this ventricle contracts, it's pushing up, and it creates tension on these strings, basically these cords, and that keeps these valves right in the position that they need to be in. So the last couple of things is to look at the blood flow through the heart, and this is one thing that you should practice. It's kind of understand blood flow through the heart and through the body. You can look at it through the diagrams that are from your textbook, and kind of shows you, step by step blood going through the heart. There's a series of steps here that kind of show that, or you could look at it through like a flow chart diagram, and that's what this is. This shows you blood going into the right atrium. Remember, there's 3 locations from the right atrium that the right atrium receives blood: the superior and inferior vena cava, the coronary sinus, and all the coronary veins and things that goes into the right atrium. Then blood is going to go through has to go past the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts. It goes through the pulmonary semilunar valve, through the pulmonary trunk, into pulmonary arteries. These arteries are now connecting over to the lung. That's where gas exchange is going to take place. And then that connects to, the lungs will connect to pulmonary veins that leads over back to the heart. Those veins go into the left atrium. Left atrium contracts. It goes through sends blood through the bicuspid or the mitral valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will contract, send blood past the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, and then through the aorta it goes. Remember, there's a branch leading to the heart itself, the coronary arteries that will supply the heart itself with blood, and then the rest of the blood goes out to the body tissues and basically the body system. In part 2 of the video, we'll look at more of the physiology of the heart in this chapter 17.